Welcome to Module 1 of the Mandated Abuse and Neglect Prevention, Critical Incident, and Human Rights Training, which should be taken annually by all staff. This module will cover types of abuse and neglect, their definitions, as well as a number of examples. Before we begin this training, please be prepared to adjust the volume on your computer to listen to the training. To enable closed captioning, press the CC button on the bottom left or right of your video display screen. This learning path contains multiple components in the form of quizzes and videos. To be marked complete for this training, you must complete all modules, pass all quizzes in addition to completing the final attestation form and mandatory reporter sign-off. Our agenda today includes reviewing abuse and neglect data, defining different types of abuse, defining neglect, review physical signs of abuse and neglect, and review behavioral signs of abuse and neglect. On this screen are the allegations of abuse and neglect reported in the fiscal year 2022. As you can see, there were over 2,000 allegations of abuse and neglect last year. Of those 2,312 allegations, 1,016 cases were substantiated. That is a 44% rate of substantiation. The list on the right-hand side of the screen further breaks down how many allegations were reported for each type of abuse and neglect. You will also see on this screen how many of each type of abuse and neglect were substantiated. These statistics reflect the numbers for the state of Connecticut, public and private sector, for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, IDD. This information was provided by the Division of Investigation within DDS for the fiscal year 2022, the date range being July 1st, 2021 to June 30th, 2022. Please note that open cases are still being investigated, but their numbers are included in the allegation number. You are a mandated reporter. This is a requirement of your job at DDS or anyone employed to support an individual funded by DDS. Regardless of a title, you are a mandated reporter. This means reporting abuse or neglect 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, not just when you are at work. This is not an option to report abuse and neglect if you witness, are informed, or suspect that it has taken place. As a mandated reporter, your failure to report suspected abuse or neglect can be reported as neglect itself and may lead to progressive discipline. Any and all types of discipline may be considered depending on the severity of the abuse and neglect that was not reported. To elaborate on the Connecticut General Statute 46A-11B, there must be reasonable cause to suspect abuse and neglect is taking place. The reporter should be prepared to explain their reasonable cause to AID Central Intake and other agencies as is necessary as to why they think there is abuse and neglect. You will notice that throughout the presentation, there will be a reference to the source for the definitions and examples that are on that slide. If you witness or suspect abuse and neglect, hear about it, or have reasonable cause to believe abuse and neglect has taken place, the first thing you should do is stop it, intervene, and protect the victim. Make sure the person receives any medical attention needed and be supportive. Be kind, compassionate, and caring. It is critically important to report it. On the screen throughout today's training, you will also see the phone number for AID, the Abuse Investigation Division. This is the central intake number to call and report abuse or neglect, which we will discuss later in today's training. This slide shows the different types of abuse that could occur: physical by nature, sexual, verbal, psychological, or financial exploitation. The definition of abuse is the willful infliction of physical pain or injury, or the willful deprivation by a caregiver of services which are necessary to the person's health and safety. Abuse also includes financial exploitation, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, or verbal abuse. Now let us look at the exact definition of abuse as defined in the DDS manual. You will notice that physical abuse is labeled as abuse and not specifically physical abuse. Abuse is considered to be physical unless otherwise specified. Willful means the intentional act or omissions or the reckless disregard for safety and consequences of one's actions or omissions. Here are some examples of abuse: hitting, shoving, tripping, pushing, pulling, scratching, pinching, cutting, or biting, or any excessive physical or chemical restraint, such as medically restraining or the overuse of one's individual's medication. These would be considered abuse by physical nature. It is also important to remember that one report can be substantiated from multiple forms of abuse. Also, all allegations of abuse are considered neglect. Neglecting to provide safety and proper care for an individual we support would always be considered neglect. The third and fourth example on the screen are great examples of this. Preventing someone from using their wheelchair would be physical abuse by nature, psychological abuse, and neglect. Physically taking away an individual's personal possessions as a means of punishment could be physical abuse by nature, psychological abuse, and neglect. Here are some examples that someone may have been abused physically: human bite marks, cuts or scratches, symptoms of internal injury, bruising or swelling, punctures, burns, broken bones or fractures, or an injury of unknown origin. With that being said, staff should be aware of the many causes for injury and not automatically assume that the injury is proof of abuse. Things to consider include: what is that person's baseline, which should be described in the person's programmatic plan? What do recent medical or behavioral documentation state for that individual? Is there a change or deviation from that baseline that may possibly indicate abuse? This is important information to assess before making a report of abuse. The location of the injury should be taken into consideration as well. We will look into that in more detail in the next slide. Some places on the body are more prone to accidental injury from a fall or misstep, depending on the person. This doesn't mean it's necessarily abuse. There should be documentation on the injury or incident. If there is not any documentation of the injury, you should report it as abuse or neglect, as an injury of unknown origin. Common injuries can occur on your knees, elbows, shins, or forehead. Again, it is important that you can find the baseline for that individual. For example, is the person on medication that's a blood thinner that may make them bruise more easily? Places on the body that are less common to have an injury from an accident are your back, chest, genitals, buttocks, abdomen, and thighs. When considering placement of an injury, it is important to consider the person's baseline and their behaviors, or the behavioral plan, along with any documentation that may be on record if applicable. Regardless, any injury should be documented. If undocumented, it should be reported as an injury of unknown origin. When evaluating if someone has been abused, it is important to consider behavioral changes that could occur in addition to physical signs or location and severity of injury on that person. Some examples of potential changes in behavior that could be signs of abuse are being more emotional, having nightmares and bedwetting, being fearful of certain environments or fearful of certain people, self-injurious behavior, if that is a change from their baseline. Self-injurious behavior could also be a potential physical sign of abuse as well. There could be a crossover amongst behavioral and physical signs you observe in some situations. Past negative behaviors reappear, increased nervousness, sleep disturbances, or any change in behavior that does not align with the person's baseline. The next section of the training, we will discuss sexual abuse. 83% of women with disabilities will be assaulted in their lives. 19% of rapes or sexual assaults against persons with disabilities were reported to the police, compared to 36% of those with persons without disabilities. About 80% of women and 30% of men with a disability have been sexually assaulted. Half of the women with disabilities that have been sexually assaulted have been assaulted more than 10 times. These statistics are shocking. This research is from a sexual abuse survey conducted by Disability Justice and talks about sexual assault on persons with intellectual disabilities as being an epidemic. But little progress has been made to prevent the assaults from occurring. It is also important to note that the perpetrator can be anyone, regardless of their background, age, gender, etc. Most of the time, the victim, especially victims with disabilities, knows and trusts the person who is sexually abusing them. Sexual abuse is defined as any sexual contact or encouragement of sexual activity between an individual and a family member, employee or paid staff, legal representative, or volunteer, regardless of consent. When looking at the definition of sexual abuse, it is important to remember that all humans are sexual beings, and most of the people we support are adults who have a right to make their own choice. However, as support staff to people with disabilities, it is important to encourage the individuals we support to build and understand healthy relationships. What we are talking about here is people who are supposed to be providing support and care, such as paid or volunteer staff and family members, taking advantage of a person they support. That would be considered sexual abuse. Some examples of sexual abuse include improper touching or groping of breasts, buttocks, or genitals, penetration, intercourse, or oral stimulation, caregiver forcing or pressuring an individual to take part in sexual acts, a caregiver exposing themselves to an individual, any inappropriate nudity, inappropriate exposure to sexual information, media, or forcing that person to watch pornography, encouraging, coaxing any sexual contact or sexual suggestive talk or remarks, a caregiver exchanging items or values for sexual acts. All of these examples constitute inappropriate sexual behavior, especially when this occurs with a family member, paid staff, volunteer, legal representative, regardless of consent. Notice that it includes a wide variety of things other than sexual intercourse, including inappropriate nudity, sexual comments or talk, improper touching, and showing magazines or videos that an individual does not want to be exposed to. All would be considered sexual abuse. Some potential physical signs of sexual abuse include difficulty in sitting or walking, pain, swelling, or itching in the genital area, painful urination, vaginal or penile discharge, injury to the mouth, bruising or bleeding in the genital area, or self-injurious behaviors. With that being said, staff should be aware of other causes of injury or physical signs of sexual abuse. Staff should not automatically assume that these injuries are related to abuse. Again, what is the person's baseline? These baseline behaviors and signs should be described in a person's programmatic plan. Is there recent medical or behavioral documentation stated for the individual? Is there a change or deviation from that baseline that might indicate sexual abuse? For example, is there a lack of documentation for injury to their genitals that could indicate sexual abuse? Is there a new medication that an individual is on that could cause genital irritation or rash? This is important information to assess a report of sexual abuse. It is a possible indication of sexual abuse for some medical conditions, such as UTIs, STD, genital rashes, unexplained itching or discharge, or unwanted pregnancy. Any medical changes should be reported to the nurse immediately. Medical staff will conduct an assessment and determine the next steps. Like physical abuse, you may see behavioral changes in a person who is being sexually abused, even if there are no physical signs. Some of these behavioral indications include an unusual demand for attention or affection, beginning a promiscuous sexual behavior or a new interest in sex, inability to sleep or wanting to sleep all the time, appetite disturbances, problems with personal boundaries, new psychiatric symptoms, or neglected hygiene. When considering these behaviors, it is critical that you take into consideration the individual's baseline behaviors. If changes in their behavior occur, the staff should reference the logbook found in ICF and CLA settings, discuss changes with the delegating nurse, and document those changes in behavior. If abuse and neglect is suspected and reported, the individual needs to present reasonable cause to AID that indicate abuse has taken place. If you suspect sexual abuse, please remember, sexual abuse is a crime and should be treated as such. If an individual self-reports a potential incident of sexual assault, you need to believe what that person says to be true. You should not do any investigation or ask any questions. This is the job of the investigation division, and you must report immediately. If the suspected abuse is not stopped, often the sexual predator will continue their behavioral pattern. And remember, anyone could be a potential sexual predator. Your primary role is to keep the person you support safe. Make sure you stop the incident and protect the victim. If the perpetrator would put you in danger if you stepped in, stop the abuse from taking place by using other means, such as pulling a fire alarm. Do not disturb any physical evidence if possible. Encourage individuals not to perform hygiene, such as a shower, bath, brushing of teeth, drinking, changing clothing, etc., until the medical evaluation is complete. Do not ask why questions. Do not press for details or challenge the person. Remember, this person is a victim. Additionally, there are trained professionals to provide support to victims of sexual abuse. That is the job for trained professionals to provide counseling to the individual. Be assuring, supportive, caring, and gentle. Notify your supervisor or manager on duty, whichever is appropriate for your work location, and report according to the procedures which we will cover in this training. DDS takes every precaution to protect the victim and seek justice. The supervisory staff on duty will make sure that the individual is safely transported to an emergency room and evaluated by medical professionals. The supervising staff will also secure the scene or area and let law enforcement officers process the scene. It is important to note that the staff who witnessed the abuse or neglect must be the one to report it and document it. The supervisor will then ensure that all proper reporting and documentation has been completed and filed appropriately. Staff should ensure that the individual has extra clothing, adaptive equipment, and any items for changing that ensure that they are comfortable and safe after the evaluation at the hospital. The house supervisor or manager will then connect the individual with a sexual assault crisis counselor who has experience assisting people with intellectual disabilities. Sexual abuse is prevalent in our culture, and awareness of this issue is increasing due to the Me Too movement. Did you know that the research shows for people with intellectual disabilities, the rate for which they are sexually abused is 7 times that of their non-disabled peers? Did you know the rate at which women with intellectual disabilities are sexually assaulted is 12 times that of their non-disabled peers? There are many reasons for these statistics. Think about why that may be the case. You can help people we support to protect themselves by teaching them it's okay to say no and to assert themselves. They need to feel that they have rights, even with their caregivers, like you. We will now be watching a video about sexual abuse. While the video plays, think about the statistics we just talked about on the previous slide, as well as the following questions. Why do you think people with disabilities are abused at a higher rate? Do the statistics surprise you? Why is the Me Too movement often not applicable to people with disabilities? Is any of the information in the video we watched new to you, or does any of this surprise you?
But first, the Me Too movement has shed light on sexual misconduct across all industries and populations. Tonight, we take a look at a group that has received little, if any, attention: people with disabilities, in particular with intellectual disabilities. NPR spent a year investigating this. According to one Justice Department figure they uncovered, those with developmental disabilities are victims of sexual assault at a rate 7 times higher than those without disabilities. For more, I'm joined by Joseph Shapiro, the NPR investigative correspondent, and Nancy Thaler, a deputy secretary at the Pennsylvania State Department of Human Services. She runs the state's developmental disability program, and she joins us from Harrisburg. Nancy Thaler and Joe Shapiro, thank you both for being here. Joe Shapiro, I'm going to start with you. As we know, there's been a lot of focus the last few months on sexual assault, sexual harassment after the Harvey Weinstein revelations, but you were working on this well before that. What drew your attention?
I've written about disability issues for a long time, decades now. And it's actually people with intellectual disabilities have been telling me about this issue for years and talking about how the past sexual violence in their lives and how it gets in the way of living their lives now, of having the relationships they want. They told me about this. It's important to them. And I thought it was time to write about it.
You, Nancy Thaler, why, I mean, before we hear more about what Joe uncovered, why is this particular group of people so vulnerable to this?
Well, I think there are a lot of factors that lead to their vulnerability, and I think it begins early in life. As children, they are touched by doctors and therapists, and their privacy is invaded in a way that's greater than it is for typical children. And so they they begin life not thinking they have control over their bodies. We teach compliance, to listen to adults and obey what adults say, and children with disabilities are more likely to follow that path than other folks are. They are easy to overpower physically, but I think the biggest factor is that they do not have the capacity to communicate. Oftentimes there is no speech, or people have speech that's difficult to understand, but even more problematic is that when they do speak, people tend not to listen to them. And finally, I think that families, caregivers, teachers are not anticipating this is a problem, so they don't even notice the signs and symptoms when there is abuse in the child or the adult's experience.
So much to consider there. Joe Shapiro, let's hear an audio excerpt from one of these powerful interviews you did over the course of the work that you did. This was a woman named Debbie Robinson. Just set this up briefly and we'll hear from her.
So Debbie Robinson is a woman when she was in her early 20s. She was sexually assaulted by someone who was related to someone in the household where she lived. She says now she couldn't name what was happening. She knew that this was some kind of relationship that she didn't like, that she didn't want it. She wanted it to stop. It's supposed to be hidden. But this was somebody that she had been taught to trust. She had not gotten sex ed in school. People hadn't spoken to her about sex or sexual assault because it was assumed as a woman with an intellectual disability, she wouldn't be interested in having relationships or sex. So when this happened, she didn't know what it was or what to do.
So let's hear just a part of that interview.
I felt dirty. I just felt not clean. I blamed myself. And I felt powerless. I couldn't even look in the mirror because you see, all that comes back to you. It just does. I had to figure out that it's not my fault.
Joe Shapiro, how typical would you say either Debbie Robinson's comments were or the comments of others you talked to?
Well, I think Debbie's comments are common because here she experienced this and she didn't know what to do. She couldn't tell anyone. Eventually, years later, I think 20 years later, she was at a conference. Someone was talking about sexual assault. It came back. She sort of repressed it. She felt she had to deal with it. But then, how do you find a therapist who knows how to talk to someone with an intellectual disability? It took a long time. She found someone. Then she couldn't get to the therapist's office. She doesn't drive. Eventually, and she didn't want to tell her parents. She was afraid to tell her parents. She hadn't had these conversations with them. Eventually, she found a friend who she confided in, who took her every day. But so I think what's common is that this happens a lot, and people are left on their own to deal with this. They don't have the same access to resources that other people do when they deal with sexual assault. Now, rape crisis centers around the country are starting to get to reach out to this population much more. There are more resources now.
And that's what I want to ask you about, Nancy Thaler. What can be done for these individuals? First of all, you have to know that it happened.
Well, I think a lot can be done, and I think, going back to childhood, I think teaching children that they have mastery over their bodies, asking permission to touch people when we're providing care to them will give them a sense that they have control. I think that teaching people about sexuality, we have this myth that people are not sexual when that's not true. They have the same feelings as everybody else. So being open about that so they understand how to have a relationship and what good touch is and what bad touch is. I think that that as a system, we need to be vigilant. Our surveillance in detecting and acting quickly, making sure that people report it. And I think above all, helping self-advocates find their voice and have a voice and feeling empowered through training and support groups. So we have to attack this problem from a lot of different angles.
And Joe Shapiro, that means family members, that means medical professionals, educators, anyone who comes in contact with these folks.
And these are people who come in contact with lots of people. They rely on lots of people in their daily lives to, we're talking about not just family, but staff people, drivers. And it's one reason why they're so vulnerable, because they deal with so many outside people. Our numbers that we got from the Justice Department show that people with intellectual disabilities are much less likely to be sexually assaulted by a stranger. And for women in general, most people sexual assault is by someone you know. And for women in general, 24% of times the person who commits the sexual assault is a stranger, 24% of the times. But for people with intellectual disabilities, 14% of the time it's a stranger.
And Nancy Thaler, the fact that it is family or someone you know makes this all the much harder to deal with, isn't it? Doesn't it?
Harder to deal with and often hard to detect. No one wants to believe it's true about people that they're living with or people they know. So it does complicate the problem.
One other question, is the Me Too movement making it easier to address this particular group of people?
I don't think there has been much impact on this problem from the Me Too movement. And I think that's an indication of how disenfranchised folks with developmental disabilities are. They're not tweeting, and the people tweeting about the Me Too movement are not thinking about them. And when you're not thought about and you're disenfranchised, you're at risk. I will say, though, that it's created a context here so that this story can be told, and it's more believable because it is in the context of the larger social issue that we're dealing with and confronting.
And Joe Shapiro, that's a reminder of why it's important for us to look at this group of people with disabilities time and again, no matter what the issue.
Right. I mean, here we are. This is a group that's at a much elevated risk of sexual assault. We're having this important discussion in this country. They should be included in it.
Joe Shapiro, thank you. Nancy Thaler, joining us from Pennsylvania, thank you. And you can hear more of Debbie Robinson's story and others as the NPR series concludes tomorrow on Morning Edition and on All Things Considered.
Let us review the number of reasons why persons with disabilities are abused at a higher rate. People with intellectual disabilities are touched by caregivers, doctors, and parents, etc., and told to be compliant. The individuals we support encounter many people without the ability to make their own choices. There is a lack of sexual education for persons with disabilities in the schools, and a continued lack of education around healthy relationships and understanding your boundaries. Unlike the Me Too movement, persons with intellectual disabilities do not have the same platforms such as social media to share their stories and relate to those who have also been sexually abused. Think about other reasons that sexual assault occurs at such a higher rate to those with intellectual disabilities. If you or someone you know is a victim of sexual assault, please contact the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Assault or the National Sexual Assault Hotline at the numbers listed on this screen. The next type of abuse we are going to discuss is psychological abuse. Psychological abuse is defined as an act that is likely to humiliate, intimidate, degrade, or demean an individual, inflict emotional harm, or invoke fear in such individual, or otherwise negatively impact on the mental health of such individual. Every employee should be careful to avoid being psychologically abusive and be aware and alert to others doing these kinds of abusive behaviors. Things such as promising something to an individual with no intention to follow through, telling an individual they are receiving services because no one loves or wants them, talking about or mimicking individuals in front of them, taking away an individual's personal possession as means of a punishment. This could be abusive and willful deprivation of service. Disregarding or hiding an item that's important to an individual. This also could be willful deprivation of services. Excessive volume of TV and radio in the home or vehicle to drown out the person who might irritate them. Overall, it is important to remember that as employees supporting individuals, we should remember to be respectful. Treat the individuals we are supporting how we would want to be treated or how we expect our loved ones to be treated if they are receiving care from someone. The next section of this training that is important to discuss is financial exploitation. Financial exploitation is defined as theft, misappropriation, or unauthorized or improper use of property, money, or other resources that are intended to be for an individual who is receiving funding or services from the department. Financial exploitation includes a wide variety of ways that you might benefit or profit from an individual you support. It is prohibitive and is considered to be abuse. such as borrowing or stealing money from an individual, having the individual pay for food, gas, items, or admission fees for staff without the team approval, selling personal items to the individual such as a computer, TV, furniture, or cell phone, trading cash for less than the full value of a gift card or gift certificate, taking food or supplies from the individual's home, gaining an individual's money by threat, persuasion, or exploitation, stealing or misusing of an individual's money or possessions, or taking any cash, valuable, medication, or other personal property. Additional examples of financial exploitation include self-directed support staff putting in for hours not worked or falsifying a timesheet, using one's individual money to pay for things for other individuals, preventing or limiting access to an individual's available funds or spending, using or opening a bank account, ATM, or credit card in the name of the individual, staff using the individual's COVID funds for personal use, or any mismanagement of an individual's financial accounts or benefits. The last type of abuse to discuss is verbal abuse. Verbal abuse is defined as the use of offensive or intimidating language that provokes or causes distress of an individual with intellectual disabilities or a person who receives services from the Department of Social Services Division of Autism Spectrum Disorder Services. Some of the things that would be considered verbal abuse include swearing, yelling, or using profanity toward or even around another individual. Derogatory language which humiliates or ridicules an individual. Language which intentionally provokes or upsets an individual. Extreme voice, volume, or multiple media volume so that the individual cannot be heard. Mimicking or name calling towards an individual. Inappropriate teasing or taunting of an individual. Or staff arguing in front of individuals that would cause the individual to be upset. The next area to discuss is neglect. Neglect is defined as the failure by a caregiver, including the Department of Developmental Service staff, DDS qualified provider staff, and CCH licensees in the case of programmatic neglect through action or inaction to provide an individual with the services necessary to maintain such individual's physical health, mental health, and safety. In addition to abuse, we must be aware of neglect. Neglect can also be programmatic neglect for an individual. It is important to note that all types of abuse are also neglect. If a staff person abuses an individual in any way, they are neglecting to care for and provide proper health and safety to the individual. Neglect is also defined as a situation where an individual either is living alone or not able to obtain the services that are necessary to maintain physical or mental health, or is not receiving such necessary services from a caregiver per the DDS manual. When talking about neglect, it is important to remember that neglect may not be willful, as we discussed with abuse. When there is a report of an injury of unknown origin, for example, a fall that results in a bruised knee that was not documented and reported correctly by staff, or the staff was not providing correct supervision, these types of allegations are oftentimes resulted in a substantiated neglect case. As a mandatory reporter, your failure to report suspected abuse or neglect can be reported as neglect itself and may lead to progressive discipline. These are some, but of course, it is not an all-inclusive list of types of neglect, including programmatic neglect. A failure to provide proper care, coverage, or vigilance or supervision. A failure to ensure adequate supply of the individual's medications. A failure to provide medical, dental, or personal care when needed. A failure to provide prescribed food or beverage consistency. Failure to provide adequate clothing for weather conditions. It would also be neglect if a person's adaptive equipment is not in good repair, items such as wheelchairs, hearing aids, a gait belt, or shower equipment. This means that the equipment is clean as well as in good working order. This training is the property of the Department of Developmental Services and is protected under state and federal law. This material cannot be altered unless permission has been granted by the Connecticut Department of Developmental Services or the third-party author. This information cannot be distributed for profit and should only be used for training purposes. Thank you for your time today. If you have any follow-up questions to this training, please email to dds.training@ct.gov.